Hello everyone, this is Keith Runyon and welcome back to A Future on Waxen Wings. I'm really excited for today's episode, which will be our first meditation written by a guest writer, Ethan Smith. Ethan and I go way back, and his story is actually linked to the conception of this very podcast. It was on one fine spring day in 2018, and Ethan and I were talking nerdy and going deep as we usually do. The conversation meandered between many topics, from ecology to philosophy to social justice, when we realized that we'd accidentally recorded our conversation. Upon listening to the audio, I remarked, "Dude, this is actually pretty good." Ethan was more skeptical, but the idea for this podcast was born. The concept of this podcast has grown and been refined considerably since that day, but Ethan has been there every step of the way, giving his thoughts and feedback. Ethan is an obsessive nonfiction reader, clocking in more than 50 books last year, and is particularly interested in issues around education, ecology, and social justice. Ethan grew up in a trailer near a small working-class town in southern Indiana, but he now hails wherever mountains reside and large forested tracts are to be found. These adventures have currently led him to Seattle, Washington, where he is a teacher. His episode today explores many intriguing themes. Is your microbiome you? Did nature end when our plastic world became ubiquitous within it? What's the real difference between some corals building reefs and some apes building skyscrapers? All that and more will be investigated in the meditation that follows. Without further ado, I give you Without Nature.
Without Nature. Last week, a friend of mine posted a spectacular image of Yosemite Valley on social media with a tagline proclaiming its awesome glory. Without argument, Yosemite Valley is one of the most majestic places on the planet, which is why I spent just under 2 years living and working in the valley, surrounded by massive granite slabs, majestic waterfalls, and giant sequoias. However, seeing the image shared this way on social media made me think, and I struggled erasing the humans and the human-constructed paths, roads, stores, and shops that I knew were present in that image and hid just beneath the magical veneer of that precisely timed photo. And this got me thinking about a concept prevalent in our culture. By repressing these uglier parts of the picture, or by literally hiding them within the frame, we construct a version of reality that exists as a double truth. And this image is but one microscopic example of this phenomenon. One of these truths proclaims pristine nature, devoid of humans, crafted by the hands of God and Mother Nature. The other peels back the wallpaper to reveal a more complex, interesting, realistic, but perhaps uncanny story of this world. It is this story that I want to interrogate more closely. To approach this story, I want to provoke a question. Does Yosemite Valley remain pristine nature if we know that there are people below that tree line? What about when we learn that a 5-star hotel exists in the background where the likes of Oprah Winfrey and Barack Obama have spent the night beneath Yosemite Falls? If not, why might it suddenly go from nature to not nature? Furthermore, why would the image be beautiful only if the human is absent and the thing we call nature present? Is there a reason why the addition of human-constructed aspects of the environment would change our understanding of that environment, especially the aesthetics? Numerous answers might exist to these questions, but a consistent one relies upon the idea of a separation of humans and nature. Putting the medium aside, it is clear that the orientation of this image of Yosemite clearly presents us with a beautiful spectacle, but it is also one laden with value, even if we do not at first notice it. But it is, in a small way, indicative of a larger idea. By demarcating the line between human and everything else, in terms of an object that we call nature, we then, perhaps inadvertently, assign a value to each. Of course, this story often goes along the lines of this. Human beings are at best ambivalent, but more likely prone to sin, or perhaps a downfall, often tainted, but occasionally redeemable, and sometimes noble. Nature then is often, at worst, a little scary, but mostly pure, virgin, innocent, and, of course, beautiful. This removal of humans from the image and the subsequent uplifting of the sublimity of the natural world has been studied extensively in aesthetics and art history and literature. Despite it being common, it is indicative of a larger idea of the separation of humans from nature. When examined closely, though, the idea begins to dissolve slowly, and a new world is discovered beyond it. In fact, as we continue, we will begin to call this idea of a separation of humans and nature the myth of nature. Because, as we will discover, the concept of nature, at least as it is presented in modern Western culture since at least the Romantics, never really quite existed as we thought it did. Only now in our age of vast information has this become strikingly apparent and important. Let's dive a little deeper into the myth of nature. Perhaps the most significant upheaval of the Anthropocene is the elimination of the concept of nature. Amongst others, Bill McKibben declared the end of nature in 1989, which he stated was the moment in Earth's history when nothing could escape the grasp of humanity because we had shaped the world so vastly that we'd even put a layer of nuclear material in the fossil record. Ironically, though, this position simply restates and repaints the nature and human divide on a different canvas. However, within it lies a truth about the idea of nature and, of course, the Anthropocene, though different from McKibben's original intention, and it is one we want to dissect. If humans evolved from a common primate ancestor, it is hard to claim that we were ever separate from the world. The problem for keeping the word nature is deciding at which point humans become distinct enough of an entity that one can draw a line between them and the environments and biomes in which they arose. It wasn't as if humans simply appeared one day from the material world completely cut off from the rest of matter. Of course, we can certainly argue that there are certain ways in which humans are separate, especially from other mammals, but this separation is related to degree, composition, and style, not necessarily a complete severing, unless you follow religious doctrine. The ways in which humans are separate from the rest of the world has been discussed and studied throughout time in philosophy, theology, and literature, and they form the very basis of the humanities. We can further complicate the myth by examining discoveries in the last half-century in microbiology and chemistry, which have continually shown how humans not only exist within complex systems, but in ways are themselves complex systems. In this way, one can imagine a tiny bit of nature existing simultaneously inside each of us. In fact, though, it is not really a tiny bit of nature at all, but rather something that is simultaneously us and not us. One example is stomach bacteria, our microbiome. Can a human really exist without their complete stomach biome, all of those small bacterium living and reproducing, contributing to the larger stomach and other organs? Probably not, at least not well. But is stomach bacteria at all human? Kind of, but not exactly. However, it is certainly a piece of a large and complex system that we call human. At what point, then, does our human self end and nature begin? Putting aside reductionism for now, let's examine that separation a little closer. When asked to conjure images of nature, people often state the obvious: trees, animals, mountains. Surely these things do exist in a way that is different from humans, at least in their emergent forms and to our senses. For example, the collection of matter that is me is obviously not the same thing to our eyes as, say, a palm tree, even if at our most basic level we are just collections of atoms. So it certainly makes sense for humans to create words and images that separate us from palm trees, and other things like toasters or mountain ranges. However, romantic thought has taught us that these entities collectively exist as something called nature. And that thing, called nature, is always over there and away from us, while we, the humans, exist here, in subjectivity, of course. But ontologically speaking, is there always something over there collectively that is nature, and something collectively here that is me? The answer to that question is much more complex than it seems at first. Philosopher Timothy Morton, who has written extensively on the topic of ecology without nature, coherently demonstrates part of this point with a thought experiment that I will paraphrase here, because it brings to light many of the flaws of our idea of nature. He asks us to think of a meadow. In the meadow exist all of the normal pieces of a meadow. Critters, leaves, dirt, fungi, grass, maybe a few bones, meadowy things. If we look at that meadow and remove one blade of grass from the meadow, is the new object we are now staring at still a meadow? It seems logical that we would conclude that it is still very meadowy. So if we continue this thought experiment, what happens if we remove 2 blades? 70? 1,000? Certainly there must exist a point, if we continued the experiment, where we would be left with 1 blade of grass or 1 mouse, which most certainly do not exist as a meadow, but rather a blade of grass or a mouse. And these are very different from the thing we started with and called a meadow. The puzzle of determining the end of the meadow is replicated closely in the idea of nature. Because we can't seem to grasp the end of the meadow firmly, we are stuck in a double bind within the meaning of the word and concept of meadow. If dissected, we discover that the singular meadow is actually comprised of numerous things that we collectively lump together and call a meadow. But only together do they exist as a meadow, not as parts, but only as a whole. Our current conception of nature works similarly. Is nature not just a stand-in, catch-all phrase for the myriad deer, mountains, skunks, banana slugs, and forested paths of our lives? A kind of false holism? At what point are those entities, which are usually composed of multiple other entities or lumps themselves, no longer nature? What about those things closer to us, such as roads, vehicles, dogs, or nuclear waste? Would we call even the aesthetically displeasing, even scary and most certainly ugly evil stuff nature? After all, they're certainly not human. Furthermore, because we assign value to nature, it inherently complicates the idea. It is here when we begin to realize the holes in our concept of nature, and that it is indeed a slippery concept, one with immense cultural force that we are still struggling to grasp. This inescapable human nature twist is similar to McKibben's idea of the end of nature. However, the further we travel, the more we realize that many ideas of nature never really quite existed as we thought they did, nor perhaps did the separation of humans from it either. Indeed, at a certain point, we can even begin to question what is human, as we have certainly lost grip on nature, but that is for another time. In a truly ecological world, we must confront these strange double binds by going even further with our knowledge, which eventually forces us to toss out old ways of knowing and challenges us to reconsider the very myths that build our foundational relationship with nearly every aspect of the world. I call them myths because, in a sense, they are true, but only partially so. They are also myths because they are collectively believed by people, and it is in this transmission that they have an impact on the world. In this way, they are almost self-fulfilling prophecies, that is, until we deconstruct them. Because, as historian Yuval Noah Harari contends, myths and collective stories shape both our internal and external worlds in a variety of means. Internally, they shape our values, morals, and judgments about people, places, and ideas. Externally, they shape the very physical structures that make up our lives. Taken a step further, we can even see how massively large and distributed ideas, such as religion or capitalism, physically affect the world in the very material substances that make them up, such as churches or semi-trucks, canals or skyscrapers, amongst other things. This effective myth on the physical and mental worlds also exists in the idea of nature, and affects everything, from how we nurture wildlife, to where we designate wilderness zones, to the places we recreate, to the places we deposit nuclear waste, because, as it turns out, a way doesn't really exist either. In an ecological age, this is why questioning myths about our thinking is critical. By interrogating these myths, even if they are true in a certain sense, we discover a world much more complex and beautiful than previously thought. As Timothy Morton warns us, this might be both dark and depressing at first as we begin to fall down the rabbit hole, but it will also be strangely uplifting and liberating. Besides, what would a worldview without this concept of nature look like?
Hey there, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this episode of A Future on Waxen Wings. To learn more about the works Ethan referenced, from Timothy Morton to Yuval Noah Harari, please check the description below. Later today, we will have the premiere of Charting Myth Through the Anthropocene, an interview with Obi Kaufmann. Stay tuned for that, and I'll see you next time on Our Future on Waxen Wings.